Well, welcome in Washington, D.C., and to our virtual audience around the world for today's timely conversation with Ditte Juul Jørgensen, the Director General for Energy at the European Commission. I'm Landon Darrence. I am Senior Director and Richard Morningstar Chair for Energy Security at the Global Energy Center at the Atlantic Council. And it's my honor to open this important conversation. The European energy crisis marks a pivotal moment in the global energy landscape, underscoring the need for energy security alongside climate action, and highlighting the importance of international cooperation in the face of crisis. As we move through the upcoming winter, transatlantic collaboration is crucial to securing Europe's energy security needs, advancing deployment of clean energy technologies, and driving successful climate policy. It's in this context that we're very excited to have a friend of the Atlantic Council here with us and have Director General Jørgensen discuss Europe's energy trajectory for the coming winter and for efforts to accelerate the clean energy transition. As a reminder, a few housekeeping rules before we get going. This conversation is public, it's on the record, streaming live over Zoom, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, and the Atlantic Council website. If you'd like to ask a question, you can do so via our webpage, askac.org, or if you're in the in-person audience, obviously, there's a microphone available, so just raise your hand. And with that, without further ado, I will hand it off to our moderator, Ambassador Richard Morningstar.
Thanks very much, Landon, and it's great to be with you again, Ditte. We've been together in this kind of situation many times now, and it's always a huge pleasure, and thank you for being with us. Let's get right to some of the issues. We're living in crazy times, and let me first ask you it's more of a current events question, but with the horrendous things going on in the Middle East, what effect that may have on European energy security. Israel's already shut down, I guess, for now anyway, gas going to Egypt. If it becomes a regional conflict, obviously it could create a lot of issues. How are you looking at it? What kind of contingencies are you thinking about? And one other thing that it's also worth mentioning, the situation with Azerbaijan and Armenia on Nagorno-Karabakh, and is there serious pushback on Caspian gas, or oil for that matter too. So, maybe some of your comments on that.
Well, thank you very much for that. First of all, thank you for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to be here. I think what we have seen over these last years of crisis and very dramatic global events, the transatlantic partnership, the transatlantic cooperation has been absolutely critical for our energy security and for global stability more generally. So always a pleasure to be here in Washington, and a pleasure to be here at Atlantic Council. When you started asking the question about current events, I was thinking, which ones are you going to throw out?
Exactly.
Because we are in an extremely challenging global environment, very, very dramatic, very recent events, but coming at a time where there have been really a series of dramatic events, and wars are being waged, dramatic and terrible wars and actions. Last week, European leaders met in the European Council and adopted very clear conclusions, including on the situation in the Middle East, the Hamas attack on Israel on the 7th of October, and the importance of protecting civilian lives, clearly condemning those attacks on civilians on the 7th of October. And so we are strongly engaged in that, and of course have a close transatlantic cooperation also on that. In my job, as you're also suggesting, we're looking at it from the energy perspective, looking at what is the impact on European security of supply and the energy security in Europe as we go into another winter that is in a crisis winter, essentially. So the immediate answer is that while the war that is taking place will have an impact, or has had an impact, on the output of natural gas from the region, that impact when it comes to European security of supply is fairly minimal. We have imported natural gas, LNG, from Egypt and via Egypt from Israel. We've got a trilateral MOU with those two countries, but the amounts are fairly limited. So we do not expect an immediate impact on security of supply in the European Union as regards natural gas. We're obviously following very closely developments and impacts on global oil markets. So far, the response has been restrained, and we hope it stays like that. And we are working closely with partners in the International Energy Agency to monitor closely the situation, the security of supply. We're making use of our European mechanisms for market monitoring and cooperation, including our oil and gas coordination groups, and we'll continue our work to secure European energy supply also in this winter. I guess the context is challenging, but it is also different in the sense that we have done what we can internally to prepare ourselves for this winter. We go into the winter with full gas storage, 98% full. We are working with our neighboring countries, including Ukraine, on gas storage. And we have clear rules for oil stocks, and we have all European countries have oil stocks covering 90 days. And so we are fairly prepared, but of course, a number of uncertainties out there that we are following closely and making sure we have the instruments we need.
Just to dot the I across the T, are you getting much pressure with respect to Azerbaijani resources as a result of the Nagorno-Karabakh situation?
Well, we're following very closely those developments and that situation as well, deeply concerned about the forced removal or movement of the Armenians in the region. So we continue to follow closely. We've clearly expressed our position vis-a-vis Azerbaijan, and that's where it is for now. So we'll continue to follow closely, and we'll see what will happen.
Maybe back to Ukraine. So where do you see things going this winter? You had a basically a successful winter last winter between storage, reduction in demand, renewables, China not buying as much as might have been expected, and so you got through. And as you said, you've got 98% or 99% storage filled, which at least takes a few months, covers it for a few months anyway. Ukraine storage and all your other, places where you're getting gas from. How do you feel about this winter?
Well, first of all, I think I'm glad you asked about Ukraine, because we need to keep our attention on the Russian war in Ukraine and in helping Ukraine. So important not to let ourselves be diverted from that. We have a very close partnership with Ukraine. Ukraine, Moldova have become accession countries, and we've got a process ongoing, including very, very close cooperation on energy issues in the energy community. So a good situation there, helping Ukraine as much as possible, and being, by some margin, the largest international donor to Ukraine. The European Union represent about more than 50% of the total support for Ukraine. So quite significant amounts there, and close cooperation. In the field of energy, we have particularly close cooperation because we've got regulatory cooperation as well that helps Ukraine prepare for a future in the European Union. And then we have the energy security, which is of particular concern, as you have also suggested. So we go into this winter well prepared, and that preparedness covers the European Union, but also our neighboring countries, with full gas storage. And in addition to the underground storage facilities that we have across the European Union, we now have a significantly increased capacity for LNG imports. And while that is not storage in the sense of security, it nonetheless is more capacity and more natural gas on our territory to cover our needs. So we go into the winter as well prepared as one can be, and with readiness. At the same time, the situation is, of course, volatile, and there are a number of uncertainties that we have to be aware of. One of the risks we see is the fact of risk to our critical infrastructure. We saw last year the destruction of the Nord Stream pipelines in the Baltic. We've seen just a few weeks ago destruction on the Baltic Connector, a very, very small inter-European connector, and not one that has significant impact on security of supply, but nonetheless, critical infrastructure is one of the areas where we need to step up our efforts, including with NATO partners and including with
Has there been a
the US.
conclusion on the Baltic-Estonia pipeline question?
No, so investigations are ongoing, exactly what happened, and I don't think that it's conclusive yet, so we follow that very closely.
Right. You know, you mentioned LNG, and obviously the importance of LNG, and I'm going to come in a minute to the FT article that we talked about earlier. But what about Russian LNG? There seems to be more and more Russian LNG coming into Europe. Spain is becoming I guess the presidency country, right? And they've been apparently one of the countries importing a lot of Russian LNG. Can you maybe explain that situation? Is anything being done to counter that? Do you see LNG imports from Russia coming down as you're planning overall gas imports being eliminated by 2027, I guess? Where does Russian LNG fit in? Then I'll come back to the FT article and US-EU cooperation.
Very good, very good. We'll start with the LNG. So first of all, I think it's important to recall where we're coming from. Before the Russian war against Ukraine, before the Russian invasion, we were dependent on Russia for about 45% of our total gas consumption. And that was primarily gas supplied to us via pipeline. That has been essentially taken out of the market, most of those 150 billion cubic meters per year. Because it was via pipeline, we have lost it not just in the European market, but also in the global markets because it has nowhere else to go. And what has happened in the course of less than 2 years is that we have replaced most of that Russian gas with LNG, primarily from the US. The US has become by far our largest supplier of LNG. We have increased imports of pipeline gas from neighboring countries, and then we have significantly reduced our demand, and we have accelerated the deployment of renewables. And so the gas we have lost, and that's about 100 billion cubic meters, is quite a significant amount, has been replaced more or less half by demand-side measures, and then the other half by LNG coming from other sources. And in that context, in a context where LNG is a much more important part of our energy mix, of our energy supply, there has also been a small increase in the imports of Russian LNG. But it is a very, very small amount. It's very, very few molecules.
In total, a small amount.
In total, exactly. And so I think it's important to get the perspective right in this context. It's not significant. I think what is significant is that we have gone from 150 billion cubic meters to below 40 this year. I think we're below 30 so far. Let's see where we get by the end of the year.
So are you telling us not to worry about Russian LNG?
At least I think it's important to get the right perspective. And the right perspective is that we, in less than 2 years, have made that very significant shift in our energy system, in our energy supply, and demand-side measures. I think at the start of the war, when we launched our Repower EU, which sets as an objective to get out of the dependence on Russian energy supplies by 2027. When we launched that in March, a year and a half ago, most commentators speculated that this would not be possible. It was simply too much. The 45% dependence was too significant, and yet here we are.
Absolutely. Let's go back. Let's go to that FT article. Of course, I thought it was a great article because you talked about US-EU cooperation, the importance of US LNG, and you were saying that LNG was going to be important for the next 1 or 2 decades anyway. And you got some blowback, even in the article. I mean, people say, well, does that mean we're going to be building all this infrastructure that's going to, just be lying fallow at some point? I know you probably won't get into what's going on within the commission itself, but you're probably hearing some things there too about what you were saying. Where are you coming from on the question of US LNG, the importance of US-EU cooperation, and do you think it's going to be sustainable over the next 10 or 20 years, in spite of a lot of, politically, a lot of people say, hey, no, we have to get out of this. This is just too much.
So if we look at the longer term or the wider perspective, by 2050 we want to be climate neutral. We have to be climate neutral in order to respect our objective of a 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold as set in the Paris Agreement on climate change. And we have analyzed, of course, how do we get there? What does that mean for our energy mix? And it's a fairly consistent picture that there will, by 2050, be a very, very little fossil energy in the system. There will be significantly higher levels of renewable energy, and there will be nuclear in the system and other carbon-free and other CO2-free energy source. But between now and 2050, we're going to continue to need molecules in the system. And when we get on the other side of 2050, the question will then be, well, will we be able to remove the carbon from any fossil that is left in the system? I'm not going to speculate on that. But what is very clear is that we're going to need to import energy over the coming decades. So that's the bigger picture. Specifically on the EU-US cooperation, as I mentioned before, we have seen a shift from pipeline gas from east, from Russia being by far the largest source of supply, to a situation where LNG is becoming important, and in particular US LNG exports. What we have done on the import side is to make sure that the infrastructure we have is aligned with that new picture. That means we have invested significantly in LNG import facilities, and we have made some limited investment in the infrastructure so that the gas can flow no longer from east to west, but from west to east, to south to north, and north to south, so that we secure energy across the European Union. On the export side, including here in the US, we hope that there will be the needed investments into export capacity, export facilities, so that the demand can be met, with a view to ensuring that we have a stable global LNG market, because that is what is going to be needed in the coming decades.
Yeah, you know, it's a political issue here in the U.S., and even I think within the Biden administration, there are different camps on these issues. There was recently a EU Summit. You're dealing with, I guess you would say, an EU-US Summit. You're dealing with your counterparts in the U.S. government. How do you feel? I mean, are you getting sufficient assurances, do you think, that this LNG is going to be available?
Well, I think you mentioned at the opening the EU-US Energy Security Task Force that we established really at the beginning of the Russian war, very, very early, and that has proven a very useful place to get together to make sure that we are ready to respond immediately to the challenges that are there. So it's distinct from the Energy Council that meets once a year and that really has a longer term perspective. The task force is one that allows us to come together and secure as much as possible coordination and a common response, and that has proven very, very effective. If you look at the immediate engagements made on both sides for achieving high levels of LNG exports from the US to the European Union, this was delivered in the first year, and that level continues with about, I think, 40 billion cubic meters so far this year. So really very impressive numbers that have been reached there. So yes, I think in that context, in our conversation with the administration, with the Biden administration, we have very good cooperation, very close conversation, and we've seen that our joint engagement has worked well.
Good. I've been asked to ask you, and it sort of relates, how are we doing together on the global methane pledge?
That is an important question, because I think just as we can see we need molecules in our energy system going forward, we of course have to make sure that those molecules are as clean as possible. So some of that will not be fossil molecules, that will be green hydrogen or hydrogen that is carbon-free. But there will, to the extent there still is fossil in our system, we need to make sure that that is as clean as possible. And reducing methane emissions linked to both oil and gas and coal is a critical element in our decarbonization, in the decarbonization of our energy, and in relation to our energy security. So the global methane pledge that was taken 2 years ago at the COP in Glasgow is an important framework for that cooperation. We followed up at COP last year, and we hope to follow up at this year's COP28 in the Emirates in just about a month's time, to make sure that we put in place the necessary frameworks for delivery. Now, there are different aspects to that. One aspect is is cooperation with producer countries to help them collect the gas that is otherwise vented or flared. If you collect the methane from that, you can actually bring additional molecules to the market. So there's a win in terms of energy security, and there is a climate win because you lower the methane emissions coming from that. So we're working closely with some of our supplier countries to make investments in that with European companies. That's one important work strand. And what we would like to do around COP28 is to put in place or start work on a roadmap for how is this going to look on a bigger scale. Then there are questions around the measuring, the monitoring, the reporting, and the verification, where the critical point is to make sure that we have a credible system. So that is a system that requires the right data, that doesn't rely exclusively on what companies themselves say, because that would leave too much room for free riders. The companies that invest in methane reduction also have an interest in making sure that that is recognized for them as they export their gas or oil to the European Union and elsewhere into global markets. And so a credible system of monitoring, of measurement, including via satellite data, and making sure that we have a certification system with recognized bodies with certainty and clarity in there. And then for us in the European Union, the third aspect that I wanted to mention is our regulatory framework. We from the Commission have made a proposal for a regulation on methane emissions with a view to reducing emissions within the European Union, but of course also looking at the import side, what can we do there? And our two co-legislators, the Council where member states are gathered and the European Parliament, are discussing that now, aiming to finalize that before COP28.
Speaking of COP28, and you've talked about how important the global methane agreement is, pledges are, and what is being done to accomplish that. Do you have any other parts of the agenda for COP28 that you'd like to talk about?
Yes, I think the first point is that energy is central to the agenda. What we need to make sure we do at this COP and going forward is continued work for mitigation, lowering greenhouse gas emissions. And it's clear that energy production, energy consumption, representing such a significant share of global greenhouse gas emissions, it means that we need to act. We need to accelerate the energy transition. We need to take action in energy. So one of the priorities for us and for the President of the European Commission is work towards a global pledge for a tripling of renewable energy and a doubling of energy efficiency improvements between now and 2030 as a collective global pledge, as an engagement to say we are going to need these investments in order for us to respect our Paris Agreement targets. So that's one of the priorities for us as we go towards COP28 as part of an overall effort to mitigate climate change, while we of course also continue work on financing and on loss and damage as a follow-up to the last
finance is a huge issue. Yeah. Good. You mentioned hydrogen, and you're from Denmark, and that's very popular in Denmark right now. And then I think maybe it was just on CNN or somewhere in the last few days, this big article about how these French scientists are saying we're going to save the world because we've discovered all of this white hydrogen buried far beneath the surface. Has this been anything has this come to the attention of the Commission yet, or your directorate at this point? Is this something that's going to be explored closely in the coming months or years?
Well, I think what is important as part of the energy transition is that we make use of all the technologies and sources that are there. And we have to make sure that for each of the sources that is available, that we have information about the life cycle, CO2 and climate impact. So that will also go for this natural hydrogen. That's one of the aspects to look at. We haven't been looking into that deeply yet, but it is something we also will be looking at. I think it's important that we are open to all technologies, all solutions, because we're going to need all of them. But again, that we make sure that we assess each of them on its merits, and merits is really a question of life cycle CO2 emissions or methane emissions, and what are the costs? Does it make sense?
Going back to LNG for a moment, there seems to be, well, you tell us, is there any change in philosophy on the willingness to enter into long-term contracts that some of the contracts with Qatar, for example, seem to be on a longer-term basis, let's say, than contracts with U.S. companies.
Yeah.
What does that mean, if anything?
Well, I think any contracts, long-term contracts, that's a business decision. And so if there's a commercial interest, then there is nothing standing in the way of entering into long-term contracts. Long-term contracts are, again, aligned with our energy mix, with our forecast for how do we cover our energy needs in Europe between now and 2050. The one point we have made in a proposal in our legislative framework, and that looks as if that will receive support by the co-legislators, is to avoid long-term contracts that go beyond 2050. Because by 2050, we are in climate neutrality, and so there we need to make sure we do not extend something that is not needed at that point in time.
Another issue related to some of the things we've already been talking about is the relationship between fossil fuels such as gas and the energy transition. And we've argued here, certainly I've argued, that it's not an either-or proposition, and that as you pointed out, even in that FT article, gas is going to continue to be important, but also how much will that affect the need to double down on the energy transition? To me, anyway, for the simple reason that the energy transition means as much to energy security as fossil fuels do, setting aside the climate part of it. How are you looking at that? Is there a consensus within the Commission on these issues? It seems to me it's going to be one of the challenges that needs to be faced over the coming years.
Well, we have a very clear common framework within the European Union, including a shared analysis of how do we get to climate neutrality and how do we get to the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 that we need. And we're currently analyzing what about 2040, what is needed by 2040. So yes, we do have a very clear common framework. And I think what's interesting is that the way we have approached this ongoing energy crisis is completely aligned with, it mirrors our European Green Deal for how to become climate neutral. So whether you want to be energy secure or whether you want to be climate neutral, you need essentially the same things. You need to make sure that you reduce the consumption by investing in energy efficiency and energy savings, but in particular the technologies that allow us to be more energy efficient. Electrification in itself is a significant change in that regard. So for heating, heat pumps, for example, and for transport and electric vehicles, just to mention the most obvious energy efficiency investments. So that's the first category, and that is the first part of the Repower EU work, how to become independent from Russian fossil fuels. The second part is green energy, so investing more in the deployment of renewables and accelerating the deployment of renewables. Over the last year, so since the outbreak of the war, we have significantly scaled up the deployment of renewables. We've had the best year, 2022, ever, and that looks set to continue in 2023. So more renewable energy is good for our energy security, it's good for affordable energy to European households and European businesses, and it is good for sustainability and for our climate targets. And then the third point is we know that there will be a need for molecules in the system. There are some sectors that are hard to abate, in particular energy-intensive industries. Some of them can electrify, some of them can make other sources of energy, but for some of them this is very, very challenging. And so how do we get the cleanest molecules that we can? And as I mentioned before, we see that as, first of all, hydrogen or power-to-X molecules, and then some fossil molecules in the system. But of course, the share of fossil in our energy system also globally depends on technologies and on how clean that can be made. We talked about reducing methane emissions, and here the transatlantic cooperation is absolutely essential also. And then, of course, we've got carbon capture and storage, carbon capture and use, where the technology is there, and we see investments taking up. So that would be another important part of our future energy system. But again, to underline that the response to the energy crisis and the response to the climate crisis, it's the same.
Yeah, I think those are the key points you were just making, that to make fossil fuels, to the extent that they continue for the coming decades, as clean as possible in the ways that you're talking about. Stay with politics for a minute. Sometimes I think some of us begin to wonder what's really happening in Europe. And the solidarity's been pretty good so far on sanctions policy, on energy policy, and so forth. But then you get, Fico winning the election in Slovakia, our friend Viktor Orban, maybe, pushback, beginning to see pushback in other countries. I think what's happened in Poland is positive, but, that's still some issues there. How do you feel looking into the future about European politics and maintaining solidarity, even with respect to Ukraine, maintaining solidarity with respect to the green transition and concerns about energy security? Is this going to be a continuing back and forth in battle, or how do you see things looking into the future?
Well, I think if we look into the future based on recent experience, then what we have seen is a clear recognition across the European Union, across all countries in the European Union, that we need to act together, that our strength lies in finding common solutions. So there's no single member state that could have managed the energy crisis and the shift away from the Russian supplies on its own, or in a smaller group of countries. That required everyone to come together. And so the solutions we've found over this last year and a half have been common solutions, agreed by consensus or by very, very large majority of European countries. That also applies to the support for Ukraine. There has been unwavering, clear support since the very beginning of the war. European leaders met just a few weeks after the Russian invasion and took the necessary decisions on repowering EU, the shifting out from the dependence, but also on support for Ukraine, including military support. So I think that recognition that we need to act together in order to maintain our strength, and the results that acting together has brought, that I think will also help us as we go forward.
We have just in a couple of minutes. I want to open it up to questions from the audience, and you can write them through, what is it, at askac.org, okay, or raise your hand and go to the microphone in a couple of minutes. But I have just two more things I want to ask you about, and I'll ask them at one time. One, a little more maybe on what can we do now to improve Ukraine's energy sector? What can be done while the war is still going on? Has there been any kind of contingency planning as to what European policy would be depending on the various scenarios which could ultimately unfold? Maybe a little bit on that, and then not related, I guess, is, we've often talked, we don't want to, have the dependency on Russia shift to dependency on China. And what's being done on like EVs to make it a better situation than what happened with solar panels? What can be done with the US and EU together in dealing with China on these key critical materials issues and so forth?
So first on Ukraine and energy security, I would just point to three aspects: nuclear, gas, and electricity. If we start with the nuclear, one of the key concerns we have, as a wider global concern, is of course the security of the Ukrainian nuclear facilities and those that have been occupied. So there we're working closely with Ukraine, we're working closely with the International Atomic Energy Agency, and we'll continue to do that. So that's the first part. As regards gas and gas supplies, we, in our contingency planning, are preparing for a situation where there would be no supplies from Russia, because we don't know if that will happen, but we need to be prepared for that, and we are prepared for that. Then when it comes to electricity, just at the outbreak of the war, the Ukrainian and Moldovan electricity systems were synchronized with the European electricity system. Right. So they are part of our system. And what we've done since then is to increase the trade capacity both ways, import and export, both as a feature for Ukraine to the extent they produce more electricity than they need to export, but also if they don't have the capacity to produce enough electricity, that they can import electricity from the European Union. So that electricity trade and continuing to strengthen that, both on the physical side with infrastructure, but also to make sure that we have stable systems on both sides. So that is ongoing as well for the energy security of Ukraine. As regards energy security in a wider sense, as you said, we cannot replace one dependence with other dependencies, and it is something we are acting on and very aware of, including in close cooperation with the US in our transatlantic partnership. We in the European Commission have presented a number of measures to address those concerns. We have suggested a Critical Raw Materials Act within the European Union and a Net Zero Industry Act to help strengthen our manufacturing capacity and help strengthen our base when it comes to critical raw materials. And then in addition to that, the Wind Power Action Plan that was presented just last week, which also looks at our manufacturing and project capacity when it comes to wind, and looking at the lessons learned from photovoltaic, where there was significant manufacturing capacity both in the EU and in the US, and that was lost about a decade ago to China. So we are taking the necessary action there. I think specifically on critical raw materials, it is a global concern and one where we need to work closely together with partners. So we're doing that, including in negotiating a critical materials agreement with the US, and one where we look forward to closing those negotiations soon.
Well, we have a couple of more minutes, and Philip, I see a question. You've got to go to a microphone.
Thanks very much, and thank you for being here. You spoke at the beginning a little bit about all the conflicts going on in the European periphery. There was also places of, let's say, fragile governance. I think about Lebanon, but there's others, including Algeria. And there's places like Bosnia where both can erupt at any day that we don't really talk about as much. I mean, the energy transition is difficult enough to carry out in places where there's peace and strong governance. So my question is, how do you think the energy transition will or is looking different in those kind of fragile spaces? And are there any policies or decisions that might be taken in the name of energy transition that could actually exacerbate either conflict or be to the detriment of development goals? I mean, we like to think win-win-win. That seems implausible. Are there trade-offs?
I think the way we approach it in the European Union is a framework that is comprehensive. And I think the fact that we have this comprehensive framework lowers the risk. I think there is no inherent risk in the transition. The question is really how do we best organize it? And so in relation to the countries in the Western Balkans and Ukraine and Moldova, we have very close cooperation in the energy community. We have regulatory alignment, including with the transition and with the direction there, but also really in the entire regulatory framework. And what we have learned in the European Union is that clear and predictable regulatory framework also creates stability for investors, for businesses, for operators. The price we're paying now for our energy, the high energy prices, the energy crisis in the European Union, has nothing to do with the energy transition, has nothing to do with our target of climate neutrality. It's a result primarily of the Russian invasion into Ukraine, and the fact that we have lost a very significant supplier, again, from the global market, not just from the European Union. Then there are a number of other global developments as well that we've seen in last years that have further exacerbated the crisis. But again, it really isn't linked to the transition. So I think the transition, if we get it right, and if we work together on the transition, it can help us be more energy secure. It can help us have more affordable energy, which is also good from a point of view of social development, a just transition and democracy, including in that region. So I think the close cooperation, the integration into the European energy market is a help to make it happen in the best possible way.
Thank you. We have a question.
Hi. I was wondering how, from your perspective...
Just could you identify yourself, too?
Oh, yes. My name's Katrina Westgard. I work at the Carnegie Endowment. And I was wondering, from your perspective as a Dane, but also your role in the European Commission, how do you see Greenland's role in the energy transition and also supplying critical minerals in the future? Thank you.
You ask about Greenland. Did I hear correctly? Yes. Yeah. Thank you. Well, Greenland has a very specific status in being part of the Danish realm, but not part of the European Union. And so obviously, as a Dane, I share to some extent a common history with Greenland, but also am acutely aware of the specific history and wealth, if you will, of Greenland culture. So I think what will be important in both of the energy transition and the access to raw materials is close cooperation with all partners, including Greenland, but really looking at it more globally. With whom can we build reliable partnerships and have a raw materials club and cooperation?
Speaking of Greenland, we've covered just about everything that I can think of, but we haven't talked about the Arctic. What's going on in your directorate with respect to Arctic issues, and how much do you think about that?
Well, I think there's a lot going on in all other parts of the world, and so if there's no acute question and no acute challenge in the Arctic, that is not the first thing in my mind when I wake up in the morning and go into the office. It obviously is part of the wider policy framework, the wider context, and it is something where, again, I think our international cooperation and transatlantic cooperation is absolutely critical, so that we approach issues related to the Arctic in the best possible way. We can all see that there are a number of challenges and risks out there, and important to work together to address.
Yeah, I think there are going to be more and more important, increasingly important issues in the Arctic, and how do we deal with what Russia's doing in the Arctic in the context of all of our other activities and sanctions and that type of thing. So it is an area maybe to keep an eye on.
Yeah.
We maybe have another minute or two. Yep, I see a question.
Hi, Deborah Kagan, the Senior Advisor at the Atlantic Council. Nice to see you. I have a more fundamental question, which is that we seem, in the haste to try to meet climate goals, we seem to be putting our eggs too much in a wind and a solar basket. And since 50% of the technologies that you refer to have not been invented yet to meet those goals, aren't we spending a lot of money and time and investment in something that in an industrial revolution will change in 5 years' time, and then we'll have to change course on how we spend our money and look at something else? So I just wonder if we're putting too much money in a can full of baskets and thinking that they're going to be the wave of the future. No pun intended on water technology.
Well, I think I would question some of the premise you're putting forward, both because the technology we need to become climate neutral is actually available. It can be improved, it can be strengthened, it can become more, we can lower the costs over time, so we need to continue innovating and investing, but we do have the technologies there. The second part of the premise with which I don't completely share your view is I don't think we're putting all of our eggs in any one basket. As we discussed earlier, we're going to need to make use of all the available technologies to achieve climate neutrality. So if you look at the supply side, we're going to need renewables, all kinds of renewables, including that technology that is there, and for example, floating offshore wind, which is there, but which requires further development. But also other types of renewables. We're going to need nuclear in our energy system, and we will see increased investment into nuclear over the coming decade or so. And then we're going to need better storage capacity in order to be able to integrate higher shares of renewable electricity into our system. And we're going to need hydrogen to become part of our energy system. So I think it's a basket with mixed berries in it, and that's the way it is going to continue. And then there's the demand side, the energy efficiency, where we have very good technologies. We have a lot of technologies that are not fully in use, but they're there. So again, we have the technologies we need. We can improve them. We need to continue to innovate, but the demand side is equally important. So I think we are having a fairly balanced approach. I think we need to continue to be open for whatever technologies will come. Fusion energy, there are investments and important projects taking place in ITER, an international project. We'll see what that brings.
Yeah, there still needs to be an all of the above approach.
Exactly.
Basically. Well, this has been great. A really wonderful discussion. Before closing, am I supposed to close it, or are you supposed to? I'm supposed. Okay. Any event, I think we've covered a lot. Is there anything that we haven't covered that you'd like to say anything about before we finish off?
I'm not sure you want to get me started, because then I will launch into a long,
Well, I know, hey,
speech about all the many
you know,
interesting things.
I mean, it's up to your schedule. I mean, I'm sure we'd love to listen to you for another couple of hours. But anyway, if there's anything else you wanted to mention.
I think once again, just to underline both the importance of European unity and the fact that we have shown that by working together we can make change happen, and we can make change happen quickly, but also the importance of the transatlantic cooperation, both in the context of energy security, but also in the context of climate security, and investing in the energy transition in the best possible way for secure, affordable, and clean energy.
Yeah, no, this has been great. I was thinking earlier, early this morning, I was speaking to a class at a business school at Dartmouth on Zoom, and it's a lot easier to ask the questions than to answer the questions. So I know we all really appreciate this discussion and your time and thoughts, and as always, it's always a pleasure, when we can have these conversations. So I want to thank you, Ditte, as well as our audience, both in person, and I know there's a huge virtual audience who are listening now and will listen later. We're always shocked at how many people end up listening to these things. And so we welcome all of your participation in future events, and especially at our flagship event, the Global Energy Forum, which is happening alongside COP28. And all the rest of you to keep an eye out on our website for not only our future events, but our website on nuclear energy policy, our initiative there, panels that we've had. Sorry, the U.S.-Africa Nuclear Summit. There's certainly going to be some fascinating discussions throughout that whole sector. Any event, I think that's the stuff that I was supposed to say. I mean, I do wing these things, but I actually have closing remarks, and so any event. So I think we will close it off, and thank you again.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Thank you.